Greetings, everyone. My name is Adil Najam. I'm the Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies here at Boston University. Welcome everyone who is joining us on the various modes and everyone who will be seeing this online. We are delighted to have you here. Welcome to Boston University. Welcome to the Pardee School, and welcome to our annual alumni weekend. We are doing this via Zoom this year again, but hope very much to be going back to seeing many of you on campus. And in fact, it's been wonderful both yesterday and now, because we are beginning to see a lot of alumni on campus. Yesterday, ComAv was buzzing not only with the students who've been back since September, but I ran into a number of alumni as the festivities of not just alumni weekend begin, but this is a particularly important and fun weekend because the lost commencement and convocations of the class of 2020 are happening this weekend. So the class of 2020, which had graduated right as COVID was hitting us, is celebrating its commencement this week, and we will have our own of the Pardee School tomorrow morning for that class and a celebration for them, and then we will have the university-wide commencement also happening tomorrow. So there is much in the air by way of excitement, and we want to add to that by this our annual tradition now for more than a decade. This has now become a tradition of the Pardee School that we gather on Alumni Weekend to look at kind of the state of the world, but in the series that we call The World in Flux. To tell you the story, we just gave it that title some 10 years ago because the world that year seemed to be really going crazy. And the world hasn't stopped going crazy since then. So every year we just use the same title, World in Flux, and we have used it also as a way to introduce to you, to showcase to you, to show our pride to you in our wonderful faculty here at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. So every year we ask 3 different colleagues from our faculty to join us and really to ask them that one question: how is the world in flux, or is it in flux in the areas that you work in? Today, I am delighted to be joined with me by Professor Shamiran Mako. Professor Shamiran Mako will be joined also by Professor Joseph Wippl and by Professor Jessica Stern. I hope you will learn much more about them on our website in their introductions. I will say more as we actually talk to them, but I hope you will also take this opportunity to learn about our other colleagues. We have a extremely impressive and wonderful faculty of nearly 40 full-time faculty now, covering all aspects of the world, and I hope that you will take time to do that. So welcome all, and without further ado, I'm going to start with Shamiran maybe. Shamiran, this big question. Is the world, how is the world looking from where you look at it? You work on the Middle East and its many complications from society to state. When you look at the world today, how do you see it?
Thank you so much for having me, Adil, and joining in this important conversation. And really great to see Joe and Jessica and everyone else on here. The world, from at least the region I study, is definitely in flux, and we're seeing a couple of parallel trends happening, in some ways exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think also at the same time that speaks to the kind of declining and stagnating both socioeconomic development outcomes, and at the same time the proliferation of non-state actors as states become weaker in certain contexts. And so there are kind of 2 broad trends that I'm paying attention to. And I think a lot of people who follow the region are paying attention to, is the decline of trust in democracy in certain contexts, whether it be, from Iraq to Lebanon to, Morocco and Tunisia, and especially Tunisia with the recent political developments there. And at the same time, all of that has really led to this, and has been as a result of, deep fractionalization in some states, civil strife in others. We're talking about pretty internationalized civil wars that have become kind of what some people refer to as these kind of frozen conflicts. So from Libya to Yemen to Syria, and to an extent Iraq as well. And perhaps if we want to warp in Afghanistan with the recent developments, but also, and at the same time, you see this kind of decline in state capacity across the board. There's also an increase in the proliferation of non-state actors. But one of the areas and one of the countries that I think has brought a bit of a shock to a lot of us that study the region, although not surprising in some ways, is that looking at Tunisia, for example, Tunisia was over the past decades seen as the Arab region's only kind of success case of the Arab Spring protests, in that it had been the only country to embark on this kind of procedural democracy, or democratization, I should say, over the past decade. And what we saw at the beginning, and really at the beginning of this year, but as a result of increased socioeconomic decline, which had been at the root of the protests a decade ago, that continued on and was made worse, as it is across the globe with the COVID-19 pandemic. But you have this kind of complete stalemate with its democratization trajectory, when in July of this year, on July 25th, the President Kais Saied, effectively dismissed and dissolved parliament. And as of about a couple of weeks ago, he passed a law that has abolished the constitution, and at the same time has allowed him to rule by decree until a new constitution is forged. And so that political space is really shrinking, and it's shrinking, pretty kind of steadily. And it's kind of reflecting much broader trends that we're seeing across the region. When we look at Arab barometer data, we see some pretty consistent trends in the decline in socioeconomic conditions, which have been historically and today at the root of mass mobilization and protest movements. And at the same time, we're actually seeing a decline in democracy and trust in democracy specifically. When people are surveyed about how they see, elected officials, how they see the parliament, how they see the security situation, all of those, in particularly in these kind of hot and contested zones and states, we're seeing this kind of pretty steady trend. And at the same time, one of the things that I'm following closely, and that's tied to my research more broadly, is, what happens when you have these weak states where the center of power is quite diffused, and where the state in the kind of traditional sense doesn't have a monopoly over the use of force. And so we see in a lot of these cases, the proliferation and permeation of non-state actors, usually pretty armed non-state actors, whether it be in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and Libya. And these non-state actors have come to govern alongside incredibly and fragile formal state structures and institutions. And tied to that is the kind of strength that they have in monopolizing informal economic sectors. And so illicit trade in goods and services, but in certain cases, also trade in narcotics and things like that. And so at least in the case of Iraq, a case I follow and is the kind of main case for my next book project, is that we're really seeing this kind of embeddedness of non-state actors in some contexts, where non-state actors, militias, usually tied to popular mobilization forces, almost exclusively, have become stronger than state actors and kind of formal coercive institutions of the state. And so you get this parallel position and trend where non-state actors are ruling, alongside, formal state structures. And oftentimes they've come to occupy pretty powerful positions. And so Iraq is going into an election in about a week, on October 10th, their general election, so, across the country. And what we've seen is this kind of, not much change in both the political actors that have been there since the first election was held in 2005. We've also seen this kind of, at the same time, mass protest movements that are largely youth-led, protesting the kind of corrupt system, the muhassasa system, the ethnic elite power sharing system that has really come to capture politics. And that in and of itself, more recently, at least since 2014, 2015, when the popular mobilization forces really kind of became you know, informal actors in terms of, you know, coercive institutions in their fight against ISIS, is that they've also come to kind of embed themselves within key political power blocks. And so there's a lot of kind of disgruntlement with the elections going in about a week. And we're seeing, you know, protest movements that are happening, but also the suppression of largely youth-led protest movements at the hands of non-state actors. And so in thinking kind of more broadly and generally what all of this means and how we think about a world in flux, I think, you know, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya to Yemen to, you know, to Syria and Lebanon, if we kind of were to draw this like one imaginary line, we've seen in some instances, you know, what happens when revolutions and kind of mass protest movements decline in both in terms of their power, but how both domestic and regional and international conditions subvert these largely kind of reform-led movements. And at the same time, really in the most comparable cases in this instance, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we've seen the outcomes of these massive failed state building and kind of foreign imposed, you know, regime change, but also democratization projects when, you know, nearly $6 trillion have been spent on these wars and very little to show for either development in infrastructure, reconstruction, but also in kind of building cohesive and coherent political orders that kind of bind citizens to the state. And so these kind of more broad trends really speak to this kind of, you know, decline in these foreign policy, you know, projects. And at the same time, some of the discussion I'm following is this kind of, you know, should the US retreat? Should the US have, you know, a kind of more moderate role in the region? And I think both of those debates are really complicated. And I kind of, you know, I think both debates also have, you know, their fault lines. And so in thinking about where the US stands in all of this is, you know, it's something that, you know, it's a debate that I'm following because it will, you know, have a great impact in, you know, if the US retreats, who's going to take over next? You know, China and Russia are not necessarily that popular. And so there's a lot that goes with that in terms of declining American power in the region and what comes next. And so these are some of the trends I'm following.
Thank you, Shamiran. Thank you, Shamiran. Thank you for setting it up so wonderfully for our next speaker, Joe Wippl, where we want to sort of pick up exactly where you left off. You know, what does this and everything else mean for the US? And more than that, not just what's happening in the world mean for the US, but also what's happening in the US means for the world. Because in a way, that's also in flux, that the US itself, changes within the US itself, are now important to think about. I wanted to also, as you were speaking, I was thinking, you know, something you said, which is very important. I would highlight for our listeners and viewers, the surprise in Tunisia. You know, many people think that the big surprise and shock was Afghanistan. I would argue, in fact, you are exactly right. Afghanistan might have been a shock, but it wasn't a surprise for anyone. Tunisia, in many ways, was much more because it signifies, as you rightly pointed out. And the other thing I would hope we will come back to you as well as others is this point that you raised about the decline in trust in democracy. And that's not just only a Middle East question. In many ways, it may become the question of our time, which is not a question about democracy, but a trust in democracy. And trust in democracy delivering, which has been such a central idea of the global polity, that if it in fact is in question, as it seems to be in so many places in the world, then where do we move? But with all of those, but with none of those, I want to introduce Joe Wippl to advance the conversation. Joe, if we could get, you know, maybe 3 to 5 minutes of a sense from you of the world as seen from the US, what are the challenges there? And I highlight for our viewers that Joe led a most wonderful discussion, which is now on our YouTube page on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 on Thursday with two of the most well-informed people you could imagine, HTS Greenway and Andy Basovich. And I would recommend that to everyone. It was, for me personally, probably the single best foreign policy discussion in terms of the US foreign policy I have heard in a very long time. So I recommend that very much, but also by way of introduction, Joe, how do you see the world as you see it this morning? We will need unmuted.
Can you hear me now? Good. I think at this early time in the morning, yeah, you've always got to be more optimistic in the morning than at any other time. You know, the world is messy, and I think that's hard for us to really have gotten used to. And as I tell students all the time, international relations are not just relations between us and others, but between others and others. Some of the great challenges that the US has in its foreign policy, and we're talking in foreign policy in the background of a polarized country, a country that doesn't, you know, half the people believe one thing, the other half of people believe something else. I think certainly a great challenge is how to get along with China. I think that's the end objective. We have to get along with China, which is going to be possibly the first country that is both economically and militarily powerful. In the past, the European Union is economically powerful, but not militarily powerful, except in its role in NATO. Russia or the Soviet Union was militarily powerful, but not economically. And the United States was both. China is on its way to being both. So the art form is going to be, how do we get China to play by the rules and at the same time recognizing its superpower status, unless they're going to hit what I believe some barriers, because they don't have the type of institutions, at least that we have. With all the problems that we do have, we have institutions which help us along to overcome, for instance, the polarization that we're in, that can overcome the economic dislocations that happen in a country like the United States. I think the other major issue for the US is Iran. And I'm very fearful, kind of the road that we're going through or by or along could lead to a war with Iran, even if we're only indirectly involved instead of being directly involved. That was just a huge mistake of the previous administration to withdraw from that agreement with Iran. You know, another, just enormous issue is the immigration issue. We have one of our professors who studies that, Professor Laurie. I read a statistic that 700 million people would rather live somewhere else rather than where they'd live. Where they came up with that number, I don't know. I think it's a conservative number. And where do they want to go? They want to go to the United States or the Anglo-Saxon world, and they want to go to Europe because they have a future. We talk a lot about democracy. Democracy is useless without the rule of law and without with a respect for human rights. That's what we consider democracy to be. That's what West Europeans do, and South Koreans and a few other countries in the world, maybe 40 countries in the world. To help that process along is very difficult, takes a lot of patience, and so on. So what do we do in the future? Well, I think we have to do everything we can to overcome the polarization that we have in the United States. I think we have to professionalize, again, our foreign service. We have to educate our people a lot better. Our people are not that well educated, especially in relation to matters that go on in other places in the world. We have to become learners instead of always teachers. That's almost a frustrating type of point. We have to remain strong socially, economically, politically. Right now, the big problem is, that socially in this country remaining strong. And then finally, I'll just agree with you on Adil, on one thing. That was a great discussion that we had yesterday. David Greenway and Andy Basovich are both friends of mine and just two of the smartest people you'll ever meet who walk the earth. So with that, and it sounds sometimes maybe a little bit more pessimistic than it really is, because if you get right down to how many violent conflicts are going on in the world, probably less than often in the past. You just keep the lid on, keep going forward. Avoid violent conflict whenever you can, and remember your own institutions. They have to remain strong.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. And thank you for pointing out on institutions again. I hope a good segue for Jessica, who I'll be going to next. But you highlighted again, and something, I go back to that conversation on Thursday, but I think it's coming into this conversation too, from what you said. Andy Basovich, I think it was, who made the point that what's really important is that the big challenges, when you look at world affairs, are no longer out there. A lot of the big challenges start from in here and how it relates to out there. And that is the point of institutions that you're also making, and links with Shamiran's points. But before we sort of open it up, and we want to have more of a conversation between the three of you, but let me first invite Jessica Stern to reflect on the world as you see it, Jessica, from your vantage point, which is broad, but very different also from only looking at states. And this is not a question for you, but I wanted to highlight, Shamiran pointed out this distinction with non-state actors and state actors, which sometimes then becomes difficult. In Afghanistan, I think, Taliban, who we have thought of as non-state actors, is now the state actors, whether it's a functional state or not. But this world that we have, which is a much more complicated world, how do you see it sitting today on this morning in 2021?
Thank you so much, Adil. I must say, listening to both you and Joe talk about the conversation on Thursday, I'm going to go watch it right away. I think Andy Basovich is playing an extraordinary role in the world today. I so admire him. A soldier who came to realize the limitations of military action, and I think that's actually one of the things that's in flux today. Is I think there is at least a recognition that we have been so hubristic, that the idea that we should be spreading democracy, and the confusion between spreading electoral democracy and liberal democracy, as both of my colleagues have pointed out, the respect for human rights, the need to protect the rights of minorities. We did not succeed, even though we accomplished our narrow counterterrorism goal in Afghanistan very quickly, but we remained there because we were trying to change the state. And similarly in Iraq, we imposed electoral democracy, but not a liberal democracy. And when we think over how many lives have been lost as a result of this hubris, according to the Cost of Wars project at Brown, and I've been somewhat involved in that project, we've spent over $6 trillion on the post 9/11 wars. Some 800,000 people have died, including 7,000 US military personnel and over 335,000 civilians. So it's horrifying, I think, to think about the mistakes that came about as a result of our hubris. And this really comes home to us when we look at what we have to see as a decline of democracy in the United States. There are many millions of people who really believe that the election was stolen, that President Joe Biden did not win. The Stop the Steal movement is still going strong. Terrible polarization. January 6th, the attack on the Capitol has really increased the sense of urgency that something needs to be done about the growing threat of domestic terrorism. But it's way beyond domestic terrorism. I think it's important to realize that, you know, if any of us thought the election was stolen, we would be very unhappy. But I think we have to empathize with and understand that there is a large portion of the population that genuinely feels that way. And there are now numerous intelligence reports warning that the assault on the Capitol will likely further radicalize the racist right. And it's actually not just in the United States, but all over the West. We are seeing more overt white supremacy, the growth, as Shamiran said, of militia groups. And, you know, I'm saying this, but at the same time, I work on terrorism. I think we have to remember, in terms of the terrorism that comes out of this, it's much more of a psychological threat than an actual threat to the integrity of the country. I always feel I better make that clear, because I work on this topic, but I actually think what you work on, Adil, is so much more important. I think the real threats going forward are climate change and the emergence of new infectious disease. Those are more important threats, but we often respond to the visible threats, and terrorism is much more visible, or certainly has been more visible than what you work on. So those are the major areas of flux I see. I think a growing sense of regret about what we did wrong in the last 20 years since 9/11, and the shaky democracy that we're seeing here in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, in some ways for making the picture a little more depressing. But also, I mean, I think the picture all three of you paint is an honest picture. It's a picture that all of us can feel in our bone. No matter what we believe on these issues, there's a sense of disquiet in the world. And you see that sense of disquiet all across the world, no matter what you're talking about. I think you rightly pointed out, thank you for pointing out the climate change issue, and the COVID issue. But I think COVID has amongst many things, I hope, made us realize that when stress comes from any direction, it exacerbates other stress in very real ways. And the manifestation, the dots may not connect directly, but the dots do connect. And climate, we are beginning to see, as we have seen with health and COVID, because it impacts people very, very directly. That fire is a fire outside your home. That flood is a flood that actually impacts, you know, your life and livelihood flow away. So those things get connected. So for all those reasons, thank you for all three of you. But the sense of disquiet that we see, I think, is a very real phenomenon. In a sense, even where things are well and economically, one of the lessons of COVID might be how we could use our wealth to keep a lot of people afloat, right? While it was very, very painful for many people. Unlike past similar crises, you could see that you could help people in various ways. So that, I think, was you know, a positive. But the point I'm trying to get to here, by opening up maybe to all three, and anyone can start, maybe Shamiran, I'll ask you first, but it's really for all three. If we just take that same question that we've just talked about, but turn it not on a positive side, but on the future. What is the flux we would want to see? Right? In this moment of great change, in the moment of great upheaval, in this moment of great disquiet, what might be the levers of the type of change that we would like to see in the areas or issues that we work on? Shamiran, you want to take a stab on that?
Sure. I think one of the things that, one of the things that we've learned, the lessons that we've learned from, in looking in my area of work, which is the outcomes of these foreign policy kind of, projects over the past decade, is I think we have a really, really good set of learned lessons. And those are, what happens when, large amounts of money are spent on infrastructure and reconstruction, propping up these institutions that just, don't seem to take hold. But we also have, I think, a good deal in looking, kind of from a more broad view of what went wrong and what, how things can improve. And I think one of the kind of areas in the case of Iraq that we're looking at is, this kind of more local level support, propping up and supporting, very localized, whether it be peace building initiatives, whether it be, empowering minority groups, socioeconomically empowering minority groups in the regions they reside, really at a grassroots level, supporting youth-led and women-led movements and initiatives. And I think, much of what has happened in terms of reconstruction and democracy promotion has focused so much on the broader kind of, whether it be NGOs or multilateral institutions, et cetera. And I think there's some very interesting and emerging research field that's looking at what's happening at the local level. And I think when we look at the local level, whether it be in Iraq and Lebanon and Libya and Afghanistan, we see people coalescing and coming together and protesting and challenging, deeply entrenched state and non-state actors that exert all forms of violence on civilians. Coming together and challenging those, those actors. And I think that's not something to be undermined. I think there's a lot of kind of, as our colleague Jeremy Menchik says, people power there that I think is incredibly, that for me gives me a lot of hope. I've seen, I think as many of us have, Afghan women go out and protest and for their right to go back to schools, to go back to their jobs and to kind of have livelihoods outside the homes in incredibly limited conditions. And again, in the case of Iraq, youth-led protests and protesters that challenge both dominant civil society narratives, but also state and non-state actors. And I think that's in flux, but I think in a more positive way, in that the local level of what's happening, that kind of microcosm is a fascinating kind of development that I've been following.
This is really fascinating, and I hope, by the way, also by way of requesting or inviting those who are listening to us, if you have questions, please do write them up for our panelists. But to highlight what Shamiran is saying, in fact, it's very, very interesting what's happening at the society level. Right? That in some ways, maybe the flux in society ought to be looked at more carefully. The Afghanistan example is a particularly interesting one. We don't know. It's really in flux. So we don't know where it will go. But here is what is interesting: the big expenditure in the infrastructure, whether it is airplanes or military bases or anything else, might have fallen quickly, but what hasn't fallen, it seems, is the 20 years in Kabul in particular. Even though the local might have sort of given into the Taliban rather quickly because they weren't enamored by an Afghan government that wasn't delivering. But what the Taliban are finding is that this is not the Kabul, and I say Kabul in particular because that's where the focus was. This is not the Kabul of 20 years ago. Yeah. That a generation that has grown with education, the generation that did go and get organized jobs, a generation that had cafes. It's not as if it was a great thriving sort of metropolis, but it was different from the Taliban of Kabul of 20 years ago. is a much bigger and difficult thing for the Taliban to move than the formal army was. So I say this out loud, not because I think it is necessarily so, but simply because it could turn out that the investment in society left a far deeper imprint then this is history will tell us where it goes. But that is the point that Shamiran was making, which I thought was very, very interesting. But Joe, any thoughts from you? What is the flux you would want to see? Unmute, please.
First, I only would like to support about 1,000% the view on climate change. It is, I think, it is the major challenge for our planet, so that our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren and beyond can live in a healthy environment. I also agree completely with Shamiran about the formation of what I call functioning justice systems have to probably start on a local level. The difficulty that often enough is the result of what often is ascribed to corruption, the problem being corruption. But corruption is a symptom, I think, of culture, history, events in the past. And that's why it makes it so difficult to overcome those things. In my 15 years here, I've seen tons of articles how Brazil was going to change, was changing. Turkey was going to change. Well, it doesn't quite happen that way because we are in a way, prisoners of our history. Regarding democracy, I love what one German woman asked me about half a dozen years ago when I was, more than that, 10 years, when I was posted in Germany. What kind of democracy have you guys got? Who has an electoral college, who has a Senate, with, the power that they have based on not a whole lot of population, Supreme Court, which is incredibly powerful. Unlike when the founding fathers were there, these were all men who died in their 60s, now they live on into their 90s. We have our own institutions to work on, both in a democracy way and I think in a functioning justice way. Voter suppression, that's real. Yeah, I don't understand it. They're actually winning elections, trying to suppress votes. So I guess they continue winning them forever, which is a real problem. But with all those things said and done, there are positive aspects to the world right now. It's very entrepreneurial. A lot of people can, the fact that we were able to develop a vaccine against this pandemic within a year's time, I think is just absolutely extraordinary. What you mentioned that, a lot of people during the pandemic were saved from not only falling into poverty, we found that some of these programs have really lifted people out of poverty, especially children. And I think that's something that they found generally in the developing world. In the developed world. I think, there's still a lot of positives. I see a lot of positives at Boston University among the students, among the faculty, and in society in general.
Thank you. Jessica, on to you, same question. What is the flux you would want to see? What is the change in any level you would want to see to maybe bring about the type of empathy that you were talking about, or other things?
Well, I think there is reason to be really excited about the impact of creativity, the human capacity to make the world a better place. I think we should all be very excited that we were able to create that vaccine so quickly. You mentioned, how can we use our wealth to make the world a better place? That is one area where we have been able to have an impact, and I think it should give us hope about other areas of flux I'm so excited about the progress made toward fusion. The fusion, which seemed like a really impossible goal, is now looking like it might actually happen. The work at MIT is actually very exciting. Here I am sort of straying into your area, Adil, where I think we need more progress if humanity is to survive. In terms of in my area, what are some of the positives? Well, I'm now working on reintegration of white supremacists, and what we're finding is actually that the way to reintegrate some violent extremists is not by arguing with them about how stupid they are and how terrible their ideology is, but as one of the NGOs in this space puts it, through love. And I have to say that when I first heard that, I was rolling my eyes. I thought that was ridiculous, but it is finding ways to help people find an identity that is pro-social, a new network that is pro-social. And so that would be an area where I do see progress, that we are learning something. The United States tends to have a very punitive approach to any kind of law breaking. Unlike there are rehabilitation programs for jihadis and violent white supremacists all over the world. We're just beginning to learn about that. And we're finding it's not really so much about the ideology, but about psychological and socioeconomic issues that can be addressed.
So I want to open up to a question, but this is actually, and again, it segues really well. I think what Jessica just said hit a nerve with me I hadn't fully thought of before, that maybe in this moment of flux, which also comes at a moment of great wealth, historically, not just in the US, but the world is amazingly well-resourced right now. That doesn't mean there are lots and lots of poor people and lots of injustice, but the world as a whole is amazingly rich. The world as a whole is amazingly knowledgeable. The vaccine that was mentioned. The world as a whole has some amazing tools and technology that we haven't had before. And so will this moment of change actually allow us to think differently about how to deal with problems that we've had a sort of standard way of dealing with, right? The punitive judicial sort of route to what we think as aberrant, sort of, is there alternatives to that? And the question that came made me also think of this. There's a question from Emiliano, which is about Ethiopia and whether the way the US is pushing for peace in Ethiopia, which is more sort of behind the scenes and diplomatically, does it show us a new US strategy of dealing with civil war and human rights abuses abroad? But I link that, maybe I'm passing that to you, Joe, but I link that to this bigger idea that I think Jessica is having us think about, that is it only that the challenges are in flux, or does our approach to challenges also need to rethink itself, right? Shamiran said the same thing, that think not just of investing in infrastructure, but of society, on society. Jessica seems to be saying something similar. Think not just of sort of arguing with people you don't agree with, but creating that space for new thinking to emerge and so on and so forth. So am I just being too starry-eyed here, or are we seeing, or could we see different approaches to old problems? Joe.
The answer is, do we have any other choice? And, I don't think we have that other choice. I think we have to play to our strengths. be honest with one another. I think that is what Jessica noted, that you cannot, I mean, I know some of these people who, don't let themselves be vaccinated and, believe that Donald Trump won the election and so on. I know it's splitting families. My friend Dan Coates even mentioned that to me. It's splitting his family. But I don't think we have any other choice except to move forward on these type of issues. And I think it is important to remember, other viewpoints, and that those other viewpoints, by the way, are not 100% wrong. I mean, there's parts of those other viewpoints, that in this polarization thing, that I think you can also look at it and say, yeah, okay, you've got a point. Maybe I have to be a little bit more flexible. Sometimes I get the feeling when I read the Globe every morning that there's a lot of whining. I mean, oh my God, this doesn't work. Well, sometimes you have to make an effort too. So I think that's
Joe,
that's
if I can push you on the Ethiopia question that we got from our audience, is there anything also, you kind of alluded to it, in foreign policy that we need to think differently? Meaning sort of Iran you mentioned, China you mentioned, right? So there is a standard sort of response that great powers do to this sort of problems. Does the world and how it is in flux invite us to think of alternative approaches? It's not exactly a parallel to the domestic, but
yeah, I think the direction you're going, in the sense that using all diplomatic means, using or encouraging the Organization of African States, the United Nations, other allies, and even other players like the Chinese, who have a lot of interest in Africa right now, to marshal forces to keep the killing down, try and find a political solution. But then there's always often the end game that they just have to fight it out. And so on, and that our involvement in there, like trying to set things right militarily, that's not going to work either. So I don't think there's 100% answer to that.
Shamiran, any thoughts on where you see in the Middle East, or what you see in the Middle East that gives you, whether it gives you hope or not, but gives you strength that things like what you are talking about are happening?
Yeah, so some of the trends that we're seeing is, again, kind of taking it down to the local level, is there's so much that's happening, both in terms of how local communities, down at the district level or the municipality level, are dealing with, whether it be severe constraints and food shortages, how, different kind of informal networks are coming together and effectively being able to provide aid under, pretty extreme kind of circumstances and conditions, from Lebanon to Syria, at least northern Syria, Iraq, and so on. And I think one of the trends that we're seeing in general is this kind of the influence and the power behind largely unaligned, diffused, unstructured, local-based protest movements that are emerging, and that have been emerging for the past, 2 years, if not before that. And so, I think in looking at these kind of smaller micro levels of contestation that are happening, that gives me hope, because it shows that people are, willing to kind of resist the system, a highly corrupt system or a highly repressive system, under, some pretty extremely repressive and limited conditions. And again, in thinking about Afghanistan, the, women who have been going out and protesting at a very local level against the Taliban, I mean, that's pretty powerful. And I think that's not something to be undermined. To the question about the peace initiatives, these kind of secret, kind of behind the doors diplomacy that's happening with the US and Ethiopia, I don't know much about that, but I think it's not a new strategy. The US has kind of leveraged, informal, indirect, and sometimes even kind of, I don't want to say covert, but definitely not through kind of formal policy channels and networks, ways in which it influences, negotiations between key actors. This has happened in Iraq, it's happened in Syria, especially Northeast Syria. And so I'm not sure it's a new strategy. And I'm not sure it's an effective strategy because sometimes it has backfired, but it's certainly, something to pay attention to.
I wonder, Shamiran, aren't these somehow, when I look at the Middle East, I always think of family businesses. There's the Sisi family business, the Mullah family business, the Assad family business, the Saud family business, and the Emiratis and so on. And I just wonder if sometime they're just not going to fall apart and come to an end. One thing that's different in the world right now is people are much more aware of things outside of their world. I mean, if you're sitting in the Central African Republic, you can look at your iPhone and look at Paris and see, well, that's Paris. Wow. Oh, that's really that. Is that the way they live? And I just have a feeling that somehow or other these family businesses are going to come to an end. And I don't know if it's going to be, in a month. I don't know if it's going to be in 20 years. But I just don't see them holding out forever. Now, some of these family businesses, traditionally, we've tended to like. Others, we don't like so much. But I just don't see that they can go on forever. Just my own opinion.
I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, I don't think any ruler, any regime kind of rules on forever. But at the same time, I think we have to look at the external factors that sustain these regimes. And for most autocratic, regimes in the Middle East, in general, if we look at who the largest kind of backer of these regimes are, they tend to be Western states. And if we map military sales, for example, to some of these incredibly, robust systems and regimes, it kind of goes back to weapons sales transactions from the US, from France, from the UK. And I think that shouldn't be separated in how we think about how these regimes sustain their hold on power. And so there's kind of a bigger structural thing than just at the local level of what's happening and the kind of, the conditions that sustain these autocrats and in some ways. And, and in the same way that you can't understand how the Syrian regime has survived without backing from Russia. And so, I think there's a lot to be said to that as well.
In some ways, I think that's the challenge, as well as maybe what I'm getting, one of the things I'm getting from this conversation. When I think of that flux that is needed is maybe in this dialogue between the two of you, sort of to think of foreign policy not simply as what is our immediate narrow goal and how best to get that irrespective of everything else. If in fact civil society and local realities are important, and that goal is achieved without fulfilling the needs of local people, then they will look from Central Africa to Paris and discuss. Maybe very quickly, Jessica, I have a question here that was sent to me in direct message, so I won't say who because I think it's meant to be anonymous, which is, are we exaggerating? Am I and all of you exaggerating the level of problems? And the question is, hasn't the world always been like this? And is it just that we are exaggerating in this moment because we are now so comfortable and doing so well that we see these problems with exaggerated lens?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's of course a very hard question to answer, but I think Joe put his finger on the reason why if we are exaggerating, why we're aware of what's going on in the world in a way that obviously we couldn't have been in the past. And there's the dark side of the internet, social media. We've all experienced the dark side of it, and we worry about our children on Instagram, but there's also a very, very positive side. And I do think that, I'd like to think that the way, there's a new, perhaps visceral recognition that we actually depend on each other in a way that maybe we haven't recognized in a visceral sense before. I mean, to get past this particular pandemic and the next one and the next one, we do depend on each other. It does matter whether we provide vaccines elsewhere in the world. It will have a huge impact on what happens to us. And I think that that's true in many areas of life. And hopefully this is bringing that home to us, the interdependence of people.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so glad you said that. My own reaction would be the same. Even if the world has always been like this, that is no reason why it should be like this. And that is no reason why it should be like this at this point in human history, with this wealth, with this knowledge, with this experience, to tolerate that. I think it's like many other social issues that I think the future deserves better. The resources that are at our command demand of us to do better. But in that realm, some of you are used to me doing this at the end. As we end, I have a rather ambitious, maybe unfair, very short one-line answer requiring question. If you could advise anyone you want to do one thing, what would that one thing be that you would say to someone, you do this, you President of the US, or you Secretary General UN, whatever it is. But if you had that Aladdin lamp or whatever and had one wish that can be done by someone, who would be the someone and what would be the wish in light of everything we've talked about? Jessica, can I put you on the spot first?
In this moment of extreme polarization in our country, my wish is that all of us try to understand the other, really try to stand in the shoes of the other, and hopefully we can.
Is there a policy sort of, would you say to someone, do this so that this can happen? Or is it really individual? Each one of us has to bear this.
Well, you gave me a choice and I've decided, rather than, instructing the head of the UN or the president, I'm thinking about each one of us. And I think it's actually almost a spiritual task. I think the polarization we see is a problem, and it's a spiritual problem, and I think it has a spiritual solution.
I actually agree with you. If our entitlements are individual, then our responsibilities must also be taken individuals, and I appreciate. Thank you for that, Joe.
I would say,
who and what?
I just to build on what Jessica said. Follow the truth as best as we as human beings can understand that truth. Learn, become skilled, and do our very best to understand one another.
Shamiran?
I think I am gonna maybe look kind of more intimately at potential, so if I were, to your question, Adil, which I think is so important, in thinking about some of the failures of these, foreign policy decisions over the past 2 decades, there's a common thread that runs through, is that in policymakers and policy circles, whether it be in the US or, in the UK or at the UN, they really become echo chambers. And they become echo chambers of a selected kind of group of experts who are not usually from the region or of the region, or don't really know much. And I can say this unequivocally about in the context of the Iraq War, and I think in Afghanistan too, who really didn't know much about Iraqi or Afghan society. And I think if there's one wish I would have, is for all of these policy circles and all of their variation, whether it be in national security and development, et cetera, is speak to the locals. Visit the locals, speak to the locals, elevate the voices of people, of experts inside the region who really know the local context better than anyone. And I think that, in thinking about some of these failures and how they could have been remedied was really in kind of, this export, the idea of exporting expertise rather than paying attention to local voices, I think may have kind of had a pretty kind of staggering effect on the outcomes that we're seeing. And so elevating those voices and being embedded in the local context is really key. And when I say local context, it's not Westerners flying into these spaces. It's actually making use of the human capital that exists in these spaces, and kind of paying attention to what they're saying.
Well, thank you very much. If I had a wish, I would wish that all your wishes come true. And then if I could sneak in a minor wish, which in some ways isn't really is much lower in the immediacy to your sort of really important and grand wishes, it would probably be to ask the President of the United States and then also ask the Premier of China to, guys, just step back. The world really is not interested in who the head honcho is. There is so much that the world can do better together than escalating superpower rivalries. I don't think I wish that will necessarily come true, but I hope yours will. I end by thanking all of you for your time, thanking all of us who have joined us here, thanking all of those who will be joining this and seeing this later, and I am very, very glad to have been enlightened by this conversation by all three of you. The world remains in flux. I suspect it will remain in flux, but as I think the theme of today has been, flux should also be an opportunity. That moment of change should be an opportunity. Opportunity ain't easy. Change is not easy. No one is saying any of this is easy. But it is possible, and it should be possible in the times that we live in, to do much better, to really look towards a better world. Thank you all.